so much, ERF and ILO. I believe we have all been thinking about the topics of jobs in Egypt. In fact, I always like to make fun of macroeconomists because we're always perceived as people that analyze the economy from thousands of feet up. So in an attempt to try to break down growth in Egypt, I'll be looking at the trend of growth in comparison to the employment rate in Egypt. So we know that growth generally, which is the dotted orange line here, has not been always associated with an increase in the employment rate. In fact, before joining the World Bank myself, almost 7 years ago, I always looked at the unemployment rate. It's when I really started working with microeconomists, the poverty economists like Nishta here, when I started to pay attention to the employment rate, which is in percent of the working age population. This phenomenon is not necessarily unique to Egypt, because when we look at the correlation between growth and employment rate across countries, it is a positive relationship, but it's not that strong. I mean, the line is sloping upwards, but it's not very steep. So it's not particularly unique to Egypt. Of course, it's just that Egypt, along with other MENA countries, are here in the lower, lower rates. Not only that, but back to this first graph, the periods that had higher growth, so what we call the growth spurt, were actually associated with a decline in the employment rate. So both here, these episodes that have been circled, show the negative relationship between growth and the employment. That's really the objective of this work, which is done at the World Bank jointly by the. It's a team work by the macroeconomics trade and investment group that I belong to. So we would like to trace the sectoral, the structure of the economy, how it evolved in terms of the GDP, employment, and then breaking down the productivity growth. So assessing the structural transformation in Egypt, say around the past almost 2 decades, and then correlating the changes that happened and the structure of the economy with the investment patterns as well. Now, the starting point is really Egypt's GDP per capita, which is here, the dotted red line, in constant terms. So upward sloping, but compared to other countries that have been, at least at one point, middle-income countries, it lags behind, the dotted red line here, Egypt. Here specifically, I choose countries that all had a starting point lower than Egypt in the year 2000, and they have all surpassed Egypt. So now we want to decompose this GDP per capita growth. A very simple technique breaks it down into 4 components. It's a very simple decomposition, such that if the terms cancel, we are back to the Y, which is GDP over the population, which is N. So basically what this says is that GDP per capita is the productivity measured as value added over per worker, and then the employment rate, the employment over the labor force, and then the labor force and percent of the working age population, and then finally the demographic part, which is the working age population as a percent of total population. This decomposition gives us this graph. The first bar up here is for the full period where we had the data, constant price GDP from the year 2000 until fiscal year 2019. Productivity in Egypt has been the highest contributor to per capita growth, even though it's not that big. These are the average yearly contributions over the period. And the participation rate, which is the gray area here, has been it has been dragging growth. So we will be looking into mainly these two, the productivity as well as the labor force participation rate. Now, compared to other countries, so a few Arab countries as well as Turkey here, Egypt has the biggest drop in the participation rate in the area in the period under study. The labor force participation has been, in comparison, relatively moderate, not as big as Turkey or Morocco in that case. We will be looking at the productivity decomposition, but first a quick overview over the labor force participation, which is where we see Egypt is relatively low, and across countries the correlation is very tight. When we correlate the labor force participation rates with the employment rates, it's very, very tightly linked. The correlation coefficient here has been above 0.8. So when we look at the participation rate in Egypt, it has been going down in both males as well as females. We took here 2 points in time, fiscal year 2006, fiscal year 2009 for both males and females. The drop in the male employment rate, which is these are the samples as we find them in the quarterly labor force survey by CapMass. In the sample, the employment dropped in males over this period by 1.5 percentage point. Half of it was explained by more students, more reported in the sample as remaining in education. The other half remains unexplained. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's not that big of a percentage compared to females. Of course, we want to see it increasing, but I mean, at least we can explain part of this drop. For females, of course, this red area, which is not, does not feature, of course, at all, are females that willingly stay, report as housewives, and it has increased, and in fact, it explains more than the drop in the employment rate for females. So the employment rate for females dropped by almost 4 percentage points in this short time period. More than, and by the way, also those reporting as students have also gone down. So it's mainly willingly, I mean, females willingly staying out of the labor force. So this is a topic. I actually had the very same question that Huda had at the beginning to Dr. Raghi, if we can add in the questionnaires anything on maybe a theoretical question, if certain conditions for females changed, would they be willing to go and work, for example, or I mean, any questions to probe that other here, even in males and females, this percentage other, which is completely unexplained here, it's as if it's a residual, it doubled in both males and females. So if there are any questions that one can add in order to understand the phenomenon of decreasing labor force participation in both males and females, that I think that can help. And we have seen how this is tightly linked to raising the employment rates in an economy. Now, regarding the sectoral trends, GDP, employment, labor productivity, we see here that these are 11 sectors in GDP and in employment. There has been a drop in the share of agriculture as well as manufacturing in GDP. In employment as well, agriculture has been going down. Some improvement in employment in manufacturing, but not that significant. Employment has been increasing in other sectors, of course, as we have seen before in Dr. Ragi's presentation and elsewhere, that the construction and the transport have been increasing in terms of employment, even though other higher value added sectors haven't been increasing much. On output per worker, it has been quite challenging to plot it because the mining sector is on a completely different scale. So I plotted here again without the mining. Most sectors are relatively low value added. They have seen some increases. We will be decomposing this now using the canonical method, which breaks down the productivity growth into the within sector and the across sector or the intersectoral, so usual. The within sector is the change in the labor productivity of a certain sector between two different time periods and weighted by the sector's initial share in employment. So theta would be the employment share of the same sector in T-1 or the initial period. And then,
Sara, can I ask you for just if you can take 1 more minute?
Ooh, okay. So within, and then the intersectoral is broken down into static reallocation and dynamic reallocation. So the static reallocation only takes into account the shift in the employment, but the dynamic takes into consideration whether that sector where employment moved to has experienced a growth or decline in the labor productivity. So this is the result for Egypt. Most of the employment growth has been because of the within agriculture and within services, because of drops in the employment rates in the two sectors, because those two sectors experienced drops in their employment rates, but agriculture received some. However, received a higher rate of employment. But this, the industry in itself has experienced a negative dynamic change, meaning that even though it is a positive development that employment has moved from lower productivity sectors to industry, but this sector has experienced a decline in its productivity. This is what sort of watered down the overall improvement in productivity. In comparison to other countries, Egypt, within industry itself, is the decline in within industry productivity is a feature that we see in other also Arab countries, but not in Morocco, not in Turkey. These have been countries that experienced higher productivity on average, as we have seen at the beginning. And then when we correlate, just to visualize, when we correlate employment growth with the labor productivity, we want sectors to be in this quadrant here where there is higher employment and higher productivity growth. But the only sectors that we see there that have had higher employment shares are construction, but without much increase in the productivity, so low productivity. Same for wholesale and retail. Manufacturing, only higher employment, but no gain in the productivity, in average productivity. Now, when we put this against public and private investment, we find that there are some similarities and then also some deviations. For example, here, this is the same chart that we have just seen on productivity here with employment, and then we replace productivity on the y-axis by the investment shares. Public investment has been quite high in construction, where we see the growth in employment, but no increase in productivity gains. Public investment has been very high. The second highest investment share increase in public sector was manufacturing, even though it was not associated with any improvement in the employment shares or productivity gains. now, just in the interest of time, I'll try to wrap up by saying that there has been, I believe the conclusion is that there has been some static improvement in Egypt's structural transformation because of movement into an industry with higher productivity relatively, but losses on the dynamic. So static gains, but dynamic losses because the productivity of industry itself went down. And then the issue of the declining labor force participation, especially among females, has been holding back GDP growth. And then this is really a call to revise the country's overall industrial policy, its investment patterns, so that they can be directed towards sectors that can achieve higher employment and higher productivity gains at the same time. Other topics that are really just food for thought is that macro stability is not really yet a done deal. I mean, I look at my colleagues from the macro as well when we talk. I mean, there have been a lot of positive achievements on the macro side, of course, but government debt is still very high. It's still there can be still crowding out of the private sector in terms of credit, access to credit. Colleagues that work on inflation show us that it's still elevated and quite volatile. So, I mean, macro is still not a done deal such that we can build on it. It still needs a lot of attention. Egypt's investment and domestic savings rates are still very low. And then the issues of the business environment and domestic internal connectivity and logistics are all issues that are hindering productivity and transformation. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.